There is a 19th century photograph that looks ordinary until you stop treating it like decoration and start treating it like evidence. A grand civic building, stone and brick, arched openings, ornamental bands, and a street lined with people who stand still for the long exposure. But the anomaly is not in their faces. It is in the architecture itself, because the lowest row of windows is not basement lighting the way captions love to claim. It is a full set of proportioned, finished, symmetrical windows that have been pushed halfway into the soil, as if the ground rose overnight and swallowed the first floor without asking permission. And right above those windows, the doors are too tall, too ceremonial, too confident, built for an entrance that no longer exists at the level where feet actually meet the street. The stairs climb and then stop at a threshold that has been amputated by earth. The iron grates sit where air should flow, but now meet compacted dirt, and the facade's careful geometry continues below the street line, as though the building never intended to have a basement at all. You never wondered why so many old cities share this same quiet injury: windows in the ground, doors that feel oversized, cornices that vanish beneath modern sidewalks, until you see it in a single frame that gives you no escape, because you can't argue with the camera's indifference. And this is where official history begins to crumble, because the standard explanation is always small and always convenient: street raising, grading, improving drainage, modernizing utilities, words that sound practical but collapse when you ask the unromantic questions that a real investigator asks. Where did the material come from? Where are the quarries? Where are the haul routes? Where are the municipal invoices large enough to account for the volume required to bury entire ground floors across districts? Where are the months of disruption that such work would impose? Where are the photographs of the work itself? Where are the engineering drawings showing doorways cut down, staircases rebuilt, ventilation rerouted, window wells redesigned? And why, if this was planned, do we see so many buildings whose buried level still carries decorative stonework, finished arches, balanced fenestration, and the same architectural dignity as the levels above, as if the basement was once the primary public face? The official narrative asks you to accept that whole streets were lifted like tablecloths, that countless owners agreed in unison, that city centers endured an improvement so massive it should have left a paper mountain. And yet what we find again and again is a thin, selective record, a few summaries, a few lines in civic reports, and then a strange blankness precisely where the scale should become undeniable. That blankness has a name: institutional silence. You can feel it when the archives speak fluently about trivial matters, lampposts, paving stones, committee meetings, yet become vague when the conversation approaches the buried floors, as if the subject itself is a corridor no one is authorized to enter. At this point, the usual defense is to accuse the observer of seeing patterns, but pattern recognition is not a crime. It is the basis of every forensic discipline, and the pattern does not stay local. It goes global, and the global repetition is what turns a curiosity into a case. From North America to Western Europe to Eastern Europe and parts of Asia, the same signature appears: grand 19th century masonry with a lower level that looks like a normal floor, now trapped under modern grade. facades whose decorative language continues below the sidewalk, arched windows that are cut by earth like a photograph torn in half, and, hauntingly, the same preference for domes, cupolas, lanterns, and metal finials placed on public buildings as if those structures were not merely symbolic but functional. You can find the same buried window phenomenon in different climates, different soils, different municipal traditions, and you can't handwave that away with one city's drainage project, because cities do not coordinate their earthworks across oceans without a shared cause. The shared cause in alternative history is called the Mudflood. And whether you treat it as a literal event, cascading series of regional disasters, or metaphor for a coordinated reset, the photographic evidence behaves like it is describing something real. A sudden rise of slurry and silt that inundated urban cores, filled streets, clogged lower rooms, and then hardened into the new ground, forcing later generations to normalize an amputated city by paving over the wound. The mainstream mind resists this because it sounds too large, but the camera does not care what sounds comfortable. It records the aftermath in stone. Now comes the question that the picture doesn't answer, but the timeline hints at. If the mud flood happened, if there was a great reset, a big dumping, a period of abrupt reclassification of cities and populations, then where did the survivors go? And why do the records suddenly fill with children who appear from nowhere? This is where the case turns from architecture to people, because the most disturbing anomaly is not a buried window, it is a buried identity. In the decades when many of these street razings supposedly occurred, reports also speak of waves of orphans, foundlings, and relocated children, numbers so large they become abstract, and abstraction is exactly how a society hides a crime in plain sight. There is a mechanism in the historical record that looks like charity and behaves like logistics: the orphan trains. Children gathered, sorted, transported, redistributed, renamed, redocumented, placed into new households or institutions under the banner of benevolence while their prior contexts dissolve. Officially, it is a humanitarian response to poverty and overcrowding. Unofficially, it is an elegant solution to a different problem: how to absorb a displaced survivor population without admitting a catastrophe that would demand explanations. Antique logistics is the phrase that keeps resurfacing in this investigation, because what appears as scattered philanthropy reveals a structured pipeline when you trace it like a supply chain: collection points, transport corridors, receiving communities, placement protocols, record-keeping practices that can be selective, and institutional environments where a child's past can be overwritten with frightening ease. If you want to reset a population, you don't need to erase every adult. You only need to break the continuity of memory in the young and assign them new anchors, new surnames, new birthdays, new stories, until the original world becomes unspeakable even inside their own minds. That is not fantasy. It is a known capacity of institutions, and it thrives on denial of the obvious. The insistence that because a process was moral, it cannot be used as a tool of control. But control is most effective when it wears the mask of compassion. Now return to the buildings with buried floors and domes and ask a different kind of question. What if those structures were part of a technological system that stopped working? And what if the catastrophe that buried the lower levels also marked the shutdown of that system? The technological accent that many alternative researchers point to is atmospheric electricity, the idea that certain architectural forms were designed to harvest, direct, or resonate with electrical potential in the air, not in a modern plug-in sense, but as distributed infrastructure. Look at the geometry of domes, the curvature, The proportions, the lanterns, the finials, the frequent use of metal frameworks and conductive elements, the placement on civic buildings rather than private homes, and the way these domes appear in networks across cities like repeating nodes. Look at the spires and ornamental crowns that appear too often to be mere decoration. Look at the way some buildings integrate water features, subterranean chambers, and ventilation shafts that could serve hydraulic or electrostatic functions. If you assume the 19th century was purely steam and soot, these shapes are aesthetic. If you allow the possibility of a parallel, partially forgotten engineering tradition, these shapes begin to look like components. And if a mudflood event filled the lower rooms, if it packed vents, submerged conduits, destroyed delicate gradients, and altered ground conductivity, then the system would fail silently, leaving behind architecture that still stands but no longer does what it once did. The result would be exactly what we see. Old buildings that feel overbuilt for their stated purpose, with grand central halls and inexplicably monumental proportions, as if there were temples of a function the modern world no longer recognizes. And then later layers of retrofit, brick infill, concrete caps, lowered ceilings applied like bandages to adapt a broken machine into a mundane office. Now ask who benefits from reframing a technological collapse as a simple era transition. Whoever inherits power after a reset benefits, because legitimacy is easier to maintain when the public believes the past was primitive and the present is the peak. If an older system existed, whether based on atmospheric electricity, advanced hydraulics, or a lost integration of materials and geometry, then acknowledging it would raise questions about why it disappeared, who shut it down, and what was gained by replacing decentralized infrastructure with centralized fuel and billing. Centralization is profitable. Centralization is governable. Centralization turns energy and movement into permission. That is motive enough to hide a prior paradigm, but hiding requires method, and method leaves footprints. The footprints appear as fires that conveniently clear districts and archives, as sudden renovations that fill arched openings with brick, as the heavy use of concrete to seal lower levels, as the rebranding of buildings, stations into warehouses, halls into schools, civic palaces into new administrative blocks, so that the original function becomes psychologically inaccessible. Another footprint is renaming itself. Streets renamed, institutions reorganized, neighborhoods reclassified, so that the narrative map no longer matches the physical map, and any attempt to compare eras becomes exhausting. Add to that the educational pipeline. If you can route displaced children into orphanages, boarding schools, and reform institutions, you can deliver standardized stories to minds that are hungry for belonging, and you can do it at scale. The phrase, "they were rewritten," sounds dramatic until you consider how paperwork works. A birth date approximated, a surname assigned, a birthplace simplified, a parent marked unknown, a file created, then copied, then summarized, and with each iteration, the prior life fades. The survivor becomes an orphan, not because no one lived, but because the system decides that no one counts. And what better cover story for a population that remembers a flooded city, a buried floor, a day when the world changed, than to tell them they are too young to be trusted, too poor to be credible, too alone to be heard. That is institutional silence, turning human experience into background noise. In this light, the orphan trains stop being a single historical program and start looking like a symptom of a larger consolidation, a population management operation that coincides with architectural anomalies and infrastructural shifts, wrapped in moral language so criticism sounds heartless. The official version insists everything is explainable and local, but the combined pattern, buried floors, repeating dome geometry, retrofits that seal rather than restore, documentary gaps, and mass child relocation behaves like a coordinated adaptation after a major discontinuity. You can call it a mudflood, you can call it a reset, you can call it the Great Dumping, but the question remains stubborn. If so many structures show signs of sudden ground-level change, and if so many children appear in records as if spawned by the era itself, then what was the event that produced both the physical burial and the social reclassification? This is the part where skepticism should sharpen, not soften, because the easiest mistake is to replace one mythology with another. The point is not to worship a theory. The point is to follow anomalies until they either dissolve or connect. And the connections keep forming. Consider the timing. Periods of urban improvement, the rise of centralized utilities, the professionalization of historical institutions, the standardization of schooling, the creation of modern identity documents, the obsession with cataloging and categorizing people. These are not neutral trends, they are instruments, and instruments can be used to heal or to control. A society recovering from disaster would need food, shelter, labor, and narrative stability. A society seizing opportunity would need the same, plus a story that makes the new order feel inevitable. What if the story we inherited, industrial progress replacing quaint old ways, was partly engineered to cover an emergency transition after a larger rupture? What if the orphans were not merely victims of poverty, but fragments of a displaced population whose parents, records, and communities were erased by flood, fire, and administrative decision? What if the buried floors are not quaint basements, but ground levels of a prior city layer? What if the domes are not decorative, but remnants of a system that once interacted with the sky? What if the reason so many old photographs feel uncanny is not the clothing or the exposure time, but the fact that they are documenting a world in the middle of being overwritten? You never wondered why the past, when you stare at it long enough, feels less like history and more like a crime scene. And this is where official history begins to crumble again, because the official frame relies on you not looking too closely, not comparing too widely, not asking why the same architectural wound appears across borders, and not noticing how quickly institutions learned to manage children as movable units. If that seems extreme, remember that the most effective operations are the ones that do not require supernatural power, only paperwork, transport, training, and time. The old world does not need to be destroyed completely. It only needs to be made unrecognizable, one sealed doorway at a time, one renamed district at a time, one child taught to forget at a time. Fires remove inconvenient evidence. Concrete makes buried levels structurally unsafe. Redevelopment makes questions anti-progress. And anyone who points at the windows in the ground is told they are romantic, ignorant, or conspiratorial. Classic denial of the obvious. Yet the stones stay. The arches stay. The symmetry stays. The geometry of domes stays. And the children, those who became orphans, grew up and told their own children whatever fragments survived the rewrite. A street that used to be lower, a building that used to have an entrance, a memory of mud, a sound of evacuation, a sense that their origin story doesn't fit. But fragments are easy to ridicule, and ridicule is cheaper than investigation. So the world becomes smooth again, a paved sidewalk over a buried floor, a neat caption over a disturbing photograph, a feel-good narrative over a logistical machine. Antique logistics returns as the hidden skeleton beneath the sentimental flesh. Atmospheric electricity returns as a forbidden question beneath the decorative dome. Institutional silence returns as the quiet pressure that teaches society which curiosities are safe and which are career-ending. And now, at the end of this trail, the final question is not whether every detail of the Mudflood theory is correct, because theories evolve, but whether you are willing to admit the possibility that the 19th century contains a discontinuity we have been trained to ignore. Because if the survivors were real, if they were gathered and redistributed, if they were rewritten until their past became officially non-existent, then the disappearance is not a mystery of nature, but a decision of power. So look again at that photograph, at the windows in the earth, and the doors that no longer open where they were meant to, and ask the question that doesn't want to be asked. If a whole layer of city can be buried and normalized, if a whole population can be renamed and absorbed, if the record can speak loudly about everything except the one thing that matters, then what else in your world is sitting in plain sight, waiting for you to notice? And what does it mean about reality if the past was not simply lived, but curated, edited, and sealed beneath a new ground level, while the survivors were sent away on trains and taught to call themselves orphans?